Good evening. Hello, everybody. Alrighty, so another evening, another stream. Yesterday was really early stream because I wasn't around in the evening, but now I'm here again, evening time. Yesterday I also went a bit over time because I wanted to get it done, but I couldn't quite. Uh, Today I fixed the remaining problem, which was not a big deal. And I also fixed the pause stack problem by making it a bit different, a pretty simple solution, which isn't great, but it's definitely a lot better than before. Um, just as a reminder, the pause stack problem is the question of when you have a pause that needs to suspend events being delivered to everything else, then the question becomes what happens if you nest that in some way, and how do you ensure that once you pop things off, the event handlers get restored and everything. So what I do now is, instead of trying to act on the region of handlers, I act on the region of a sort of event target. So the stack is now tells you which object to direct events to. And so the top object always gets the events, and that can then decide where to delegate things to. And so when you pause, it just pushes an object on there, and when you unpause, it pops one off. And that works much better than before. Um, Unfortunately, of course, you need to do some kludgy thingies as well. So, for instance, in the editor, when that's active, it needs to actually manually dispatch the events to the controller and the camera so that those still work as expected. But otherwise, this works now just fine. So I can, be over here, save a state, go over there, and reload that state. Whoops. And it crashes. Great. What was that? That's new. It worked just before the stream. I tested it that it would work. And now it doesn't. Amazing. Aren't computers just fucking magic? Okay, let's try that again. Let's go over here. Open the thing. Save the thing. Close it. Go over here. Load the thing. And now it worked. There you go. Save states. Fantastic. There's still some problems with the save states as they are right now. For instance, when you load in a save state, it replaces the entire region because it doesn't know what the diff is. So it reloads the entire region when you load a save state, which is pretty bad. There's some ways of reducing the amount of loading being done. Especially, I want to avoid reloading the chunk data, which is shouldn't be hard to do. But yeah, I'll have to investigate how to do that. But other than that, saving and loading stuff should now be good. Hello, Buck13, good evening, and also good evening to everyone else. Yeah, it's a Heisenbug. That's the typical nomenclature for this kind of thing. I don't know what was happening. Some kind of resource loading garbage. Whomst nosed. Alright. So, we're still not quite done with the entire charade of quests and dialogue and whatever, because we don't have an editor to actually create these things in. That isn't a cumbersome text file. So, I said last time that that was going to be what I'm doing next. And so today, I didn't do a lot, because I also went out and walked around the city and read a book and got really tired. And now I'm still really tired, but I'm trying to do my best for the stream. In either case, I had a quick consideration about what I could be doing, and I had a quick look at the options of what's possible to do. So the current situation regarding user interfaces in Lisp is a bit less ideal than I would like. Typically, so far, I've made pretty much all of my UIs using Qt, Qt4 to be specific, and Qt4 is really, really old. It's not supported any longer, but that doesn't really matter to me very much because it works most of the time. The problem is more that Qt is a huge thing. The libraries, the Qt libraries, the core libraries themselves are like 50 megabytes. And they're a huge C++ thingy. And debugging things, errors happening from Qt is a royal pain in the ass. And in general, it's always bothered me quite a bit that I had to go through these hoops. I also don't really like the way a lot of the Qt widgets work. They have restrictions that seem really bizarre to me. And of course, because they're not first-class citizens, it's hard to deal with that. So, what are the alternatives? Well, there's GDK, but the bindings for GDK are, as far as I understand, in the worse state than the bindings for Qt are, at least in terms of Lispiness. I did quite a lot of work to make that better for Qt. And GDK has the exact same problems, plus it has bigger problems where it's not really designed to work on Windows and OS X, though I hear it can work there as well. So that's not an option either. What else do we have? We have LTK, or TK, the TCL toolkit. And TK is extremely minimal. At least there is a pure Lisp client in it, so you can use it. Talks over a TCP thingy. But TK is a bit... I don't know, I looked into it a bit, but it's a bit too minimal for me to really bother getting into it and writing anything in it, I feel like. And then what else do we have? We have some more C++ libraries that have very rudimentary bindings to them. And then we have Clim. Now, Clim has always been interesting to me, but I never really took the time to go into it because it seems like a bigger undertaking than I generally would like to do. And Clim is tied currently to X11, and they have no immediate plans to make any other backends that would work cross-platform. So if you want to run a Clim app on Windows, you got to ship an X server. Same for OS X. That, to me, is a no-go. I might still do a stream or look at it myself at some point, just to see how things are done and see if I can gather any useful resources from it, useful thoughts and ideas on how UIs should be done. But to my best intentions, I just can't really get over it and just hop into it. I don't know why, but something is just holding me back, and I get a weird feeling when I think about Clim. Probably very undeserved, I know. I unfortunately can't offer real technical reasons beyond my dislike of it only being on X11, so there you go. Now, as I was thinking about things, obviously I was going to need a toolkit that works natively in GL at some point anyway. The game is going to need extensive UI for certain things. And so, well, why not just do that? Now, when you talk about GL UIs, there's a bunch of those too, but they're all pretty much just C++ or C libraries. And I don't want to deal with that. I really, really don't. That's the biggest plus for Klim for me, and the biggest negative about pretty much anything else that's not TK or just an X11 bindings that goes directly. So yeah, I really don't want to deal with another C UI library. I don't have the energy for that. I do have the energy for committing to
Clearly,
much
you need
more
to
work.
make list bindings for swing.
There are, I'm sure, and if you run on ABCL, you can use those directly. Swing, I've always kind of felt like is an okay thingy. I don't know, maybe that's because it was the first thing I learned. I don't know. Either way, clearly I'm not going to use Swing, because I don't want to deal with Java. So, tonight, because I'm kind of tired, and also because I like to plan and specify before rushing into things when I commit to larger projects, we're going to be doing a talking stream. Meaning it's going to be a stream of me talking, and hopefully you guys talking, and discussing various UI toolkits, what they do, how they do it, and how they could be done, and what's important, what's not so important, and generally, you know, what this kind of system needs to be able to do and how we could do it, so that we have a sort of a plan on how to write a UI toolkit for real. Now, my birds are getting real rowdy. Unfortunately, I don't understand their thoughts on UI toolkits, no matter how much they might try.
What makes a toolkit good?
But we're gonna hop on over and go into my second monitor, and I'm gonna start drawing some stuff, because I feel like drawing stuff is gonna be imperative for this. So give me a while as I set things up and get my Wacom display ready for drawery. Not going to be painting or anything, I just want to make sketches. There we go. Now you can observe my beautiful handwriting, which is not beautiful at all and really crappy. My apologies in advance. Okay. So I think the first thing to think about is what are the responsibilities of a UI toolkit. Naturally, when you think about, UIs, the first thing that comes to mind is the visuals.
Notch, the guy behind Minecraft, has implemented a pretty cool UI system for his Ludum Dare game Minecraft. That might be a good inspiration.
Okay, I don't have any info on that right now, so I don't know what it does differently than every other toolkit out there. There's a couple of different paradigms for UI toolkits as far as I'm aware, and one of them is the Klim paradigm, because I've never seen it anywhere else. Klim has some interesting ideas for how to do things, and then there's like immediate mode UIs, and then there's UIs that are the standard detached event loop component tree kind of thingy, swing, QT, GDK, LTK, or TK, and all of those things. Probably WX widgets, all of those. Most of them are component trees. Immediate mode thingies have gathered a bit of interest recently due to nuclear and I believe IMGUI or whatever doing those kinds of things. I'm not gonna do immediate mode because I don't like the paradigm, so there you go. Alright, so let's think about what the responsibilities are. Responsibilities. English spelling is terrible. Alright, so in my mind, there are... Is the audio a bit off? I'm not sure what that means. Off in what way? Am I quiet or... What's the problem with the audio?
Sounds fine to my ears.
Okay. Oh, I forgot to start the things. Music in the background. Okay. Unless the audio problem is elaborated upon. Now it works. Okay. Alright. Sure wish my words would shut up. Okay, so in my mind, there's basically 4 or maybe 3 responsibilities that fall upon a UI toolkit. The first is, of course, input management. So, oh my god. I'm specifically mentioning input management before any kind of display stuff because essentially, in my view, a UI toolkit is more concerned about receiving and interpreting the user's coordination and inputs than anything else. So the drawing could potentially be external and not necessarily a part of the toolkit itself. So this seems to me to be the primary thing it should solve, which is to say it, takes the input events that the user generates and interprets them and turns them in some kind of actionable events or other kinds of state changes that can be observed and usefully interpreted by the system.
I'm really hoping you change the pen color to green cause it is my favorite.
No, that seems bad for readability. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is focus management. So, focus. Focus management is less apparent when you're dealing with a UI that's pointer based. So when you have a cursor, a mouse cursor, or a pointer of some kind, then focus management is less apparent because you're simply going to click on a button, right? And so it only needs to know the position, and then it knows which button you clicked on. But it is much more important for game UIs and UIs that deal with different kinds of input schemes. For instance, when you have a controller, you obviously don't have a cursor to point with, so focus needs to be handled in a different way. So a classic example would be something like you have a window sort of like this, and then you have maybe a sidebar, and there you have like a menu that has different options. And so the focus needs to allow you to, when you're working with a controller, you need to be able to say when you're currently focused on, I guess, the game. Let's say we're working on a some kind of editor, I guess, and it has a sidebar with new things to enter into the game. So currently the focus is in the actual game, and we want to switch over and actually select one of these buttons. So the focus management needs to allow you to first leave focus out of this current context, go into the parent one, which is the entire window, and then from there switch focus over to this, and then go focus in there, and then switch over like this, and then activate this option. So there's a focus management in place that isn't necessarily pointer based. So we need to deal with being able to select things iteratively along some kind of scheme. Furthermore, there's the case of where do actual input events go? So when the UI toolkit receives some kind of input, which component should deal with the input at which point? Typically, you have some kind of either bubble down or bubble up kinds of mechanics, where you have some kind of element that currently has the focus. So for instance, we have, this button that has currently the focus. It's not pressed or anything, it's just currently sort of selected. And so when an event comes in, it could say, all right, so we're directing this event to the button, and the button only really cares about activate or, yeah, that's it. So it only cares about whether it's being pressed or not. And if it's not, then it just delegates that event upwards to its sort of parent container, and that parent container can decide what to do with it. So for instance, if it were a next option thing, the parent could decide to redirect the focus to the next element. Or similarly, if it's go back, then it would direct focus outwards. So that's sort of part of the focus and input management. And then you have the problem of layouting. Layouting is a big thing for UI toolkits, and one thing that I find most of them to be extremely lacking in. Most of the toolkits seem to have very, very primitive kinds of layout mechanisms, or layout mechanisms that are hard to control properly. So that's something that I consider a lot more important than seems to be supported in most things. So particularly in a game where you can have many different resolutions that need to be supported. So you could have a game that's on an almost square 4x3 display, where you could have a very wide screen over like 2 displays screen. And if you have some kind of HUD or whatever, then you might have things that are sort of positioned in an upper right corner, or you might have things that need to stretch.
Are there papers or other sources on good layouting systems, though?
I have no idea. I've never actually looked for papers or research on that area. So you might have things that sort of, for instance, you might have a minimap, which obviously should stay square, but it might need to scale nevertheless, depending on how you scale up your resolution. So it should stay relative in size to the overall resolution compared to a standard resolution, but it should still stay squared, so not get stretched. Or you might have components that should be stretched. For instance, you might have a health bar or something which should get stretched if the display is wider than not, but maybe not stretched all the way if it gets taller. So layouting is actually quite a complicated system. I have an idea on how to do this. It's not my original idea, but it is an idea I've never seen anywhere else before, and I would like to try it. I'll go into that in a second. So the final responsibility, as I see it, is drawing. So UI display actual. Okay. Or rendering, let's call it that. So the UI rendering part is kind of, especially if I'm thinking about the context of games, typically most games have a very unique kind of style to their UI, so they want to be able to style how an element is presented in very precise kinds of fashions. So ideally the toolkit should allow you to easily control how the rendering of a component is done without having to rewrite the logic that's going around it. Symptom is saying GDK switching to constraint-based layouts, I think. That's interesting. How does that work? Let me read real quick, and from the link you posted. Okay. I see. I see. That's interesting, yeah. Okay, but let me get to my idea in a second. So the rendering needs to be able to support customizing the UI, the look of a component without actually having to change the component itself or having to re-implement the behavior of input and focus and layout. So these should stay independent of rendering. Similarly, the layout should stay independent of everything else, of course, and so forth. So these are, as far as I can tell, except for maybe these two are kind of a bit tied together, these are independent responsibilities that need to be designed in different ways. So for instance, when you consider this container tree model, this might be good for focus management in a certain representation, but it might not be good for rendering or layout management. So I don't think a single representation is going to cut it of how these components are related to each other. So I think that's one of the first kinds of changes I've been thinking about compared to the UI toolkits I know about. Because typically you have one structure, one kind of tree thingy, and everything is handled through that one tree rather than through separate kinds of representations. That's just an idea I have no backing to it, so yeah. I'll have to look at those constraint-based layouts a bit more though. Because it seems pretty similar to what I wanted to do. So, alright, let me tell you my idea. My idea is to do an energy minimization algorithm. Or rather, to say each element in the UI toolkit expresses its sizing constraints as a form of an energy function, which is the energy is high if the component is in a state it doesn't want to be in, and it's low if it's in a natural kind of ideal state. And so what the system would do is evaluate the energy function for all the components and then try to do a global minimization on the width and height properties. That's the basic gist of it. So you can sort of imagine it as each component having sort of springs attached both inside and outside, and you attach these springs somewhere and give them some kind of a function that describes how far they're stretched, and the system will then try to do a non-linear optimization on these springs to determine the ideal positioning. That's the basic gist of it. So you're kind of working with constraints, but in a less concrete way. It's more, I guess, more freeform, or at least it feels that way from the limited understanding I have of both. Right, so let's just jolt down some of these basic. Hold on, I organized this in a bad way. Let's just write down what kinds of paradigms or algorithms you know about layout algos. So we have obviously fixed positioning, and then we have this kind of, I don't even know what to call what most things do. I guess a box model kind of thingy, you know, where you put boxes within boxes and they're either stacked horizontally or vertically and then stretched or not stretched, I guess. So I guess box model, that would be. And then we have this, I guess what would you call, I guess, a document model for like CSS and stuff like that? Though, I'm not sure. What to call that either. And then you have constraints based. And then finally you have energy minimization, I guess. Okay. For focus management, I'm pretty sure the only thing that really makes sense is a kind of a tree. Though it, as mentioned, it can't be the same kind of tree as used in layout or input management. So, right. Tree base. Whoa. Go deeper. Next. Previous. Go outwards. So for the focus management, you basically only need these 4 operations. If you're in a container, select the previous one or select the next thing, or go 1 focus level higher or go 1 focus level deeper. And that should allow a focus management that works with just buttons instead of pointers. So I guess the pointer-based model is like cursors, or no, position-based, or vision-based. Okay. Now for UI rendering, there's 3 models I'm aware of, one of which I have very, very little experience with. So the first is component rendering, so the component itself says how it's rendered and that's it. This is typically employed in some kind of roundabout fashion in most toolkits I've seen. So they have some kind of draw or paint method which does whatever it needs to draw that component. Things get much more complicated because they then have also very elaborate style sheets at some points, or they might have like different looks and feels or whatever you want to call it that have some form of control over how things are drawn, but not really. Yeah. Whoops, sorry about that. That was probably really loud. And then you have the style sheet approach, which is basically CSS and stuff like that. Style sheet. Style sheets. And then finally you have what's used in Clim, which is what I know the least about, which are presentations, as far as I know. Symptom can probably tell me a bit more about that, because I don't really know. Wait, let me not do air quotes. Let me do a question mark. There we go. As far as I know, presentations are basically allow you to visualize objects in different ways depending on what you want to present them as. But I don't really know how it works, or, you know, whether that assessment even is correct. There we go. And then we have input management. So for input management,
Klim has multiple paradigms. For example, it has widgets with box model layout as well.
So what's the presentation stuff about? Because that seemed very interesting to me. So input management, I believe there's two different ways of doing that. One is bubble up and the other one is bubble down, so depending on the
Hard to
focus.
explain in one sentence, but it allows attaching visual representations as well as certain actions to Lisp objects.
Okay. Yeah, I'm probably putting a lot of pressure on you for, to explain this during the stream. Sorry about that. Yeah, I should just read the Klim documentation finally. It's been on my to-do for years, and it's just keeps slipping me by. Okay. So for input management, basically you can either have the event be attached to the root, and the root has kind of a, it knows how to go up to the focused element, and so it keeps delegating the element upwards until there's something that consumes the event. That's a bit, you know, I don't like that as much, because it means that whenever you receive an event, the component first needs to check whether it's currently active to know whether it should do something with it. And so to me, the flow down method is much more natural, where the event always arrives at the currently, well, actually there's, now I think about it, it's more like a double scheme. So if you're in a deep element, then the event arrives here and then flows upwards or flows downwards, depending on how you see the stack. until something decides to handle it. But if you say have a pointer event, so you're currently in this element, but you click here, then first it bubbles upwards to the root, but then it needs to traverse sideways and sort of activate this component. So it's not quite that simple for pointer events. But still, it's kind of, I guess, it's a decision of, let me rewrite this in a more understandable manner. So it's either root first or focus first. So whoever receives the event first, and then how the event travels from there is kind of, I suppose, the same for anything that isn't a pointer event. Or not, yeah. Okay. For the UI rendering part, what I would imagine to work the best for the purposes I'm intending this to be for would be to have some kind of generic function, you know, which has three arguments basically. It has both a let me write this different. Let's just say you have a draw method function which takes the components to draw, the targets to draw onto, or no, it needs to be differently ordered. It needs to take a style, I guess, and then a component and a target to draw onto. Again, apologies if you cannot fucking read my shit. My handwriting is not the best. But if I wrote any prettier, it would take ages. So I think this would be a good way of handling it, because it means you can create some kind of subclass of a style and customize how things are drawn based on that. And that should allow enough flexibility to sort of influence the rendering without having to touch any of the rest of the stuff. And I'm guessing that the order in which things are drawn would not be handled by the draw function itself. So meaning this would be a tail call of some form. Or, well, tail call. It would just be, you know, you don't call draw on a sub-component, so to speak. Because I feel like the ordering of the components is not necessarily always clear in a tree-like fashion. Or, as mentioned before, there could be multiple kinds of trees, depending on what you care about. Because, for instance, for the input management, or for the input and the focus management, or especially for the focus management, you probably will have components that should not have the ability to be focused at all, because they're just there for layouting or other kinds of structural purposes. So there's a different kind of tree there. Or you might have structures that are visually distinct but should be in the same layout group. So for instance, if you have two sidebars, I guess, then you might want to have a toggle between those rather than going into the middle first. Even though these three might be visually aligned in a horizontal way. So from the focus perspective, there's sort of a hidden container here that encompasses these two but doesn't encompass the center component. again, for the layout algorithms, I feel like there's no hurting in implementing multiple ones of those. So you could potentially have different kinds of layout containers that implement different logic. So this could be potentially anything, but I'm most excited about trying out this idea here, because I haven't seen that done before, and it might actually be pretty cool, or it might be a pile of burning trash, and it will be super unintuitive to do anything in it. I don't know. For focus management, we'll need to do both, because games will probably be available on both kinds of devices, or used with both kinds of devices, so both need to be supported. And for focus management, I'm pretty sure I want to go focus first. Or input management, sorry. And then bubble from there. Yeah. The presentations thing is still interesting to me, though. Because that might be useful outside of, how this goes. Meaning, from the way I understand it, how Symptom sort of explained it is that you can have data containers, some kind of object that holds some kind of data, and you might want to display that on screen in some way. So we could have like the actual health bar or whatever, and then there's a way of attaching a visualization of that health bar and making that be visible, but it's a bit cloudy right now, and I'll make sure to read up on it once I have the time. Probably tomorrow, actually. Not on stream, though, because I don't think going to read documentation is going to make for very exciting streaming material. Okay. Anything else?
You could read it out loud.
No. Come on, son. That's terrible. It's not like a goddamn novel or anything. It's documentation. If somebody reads it out, it's not gonna be better because of that. It's only gonna be slower. And I'm gonna stumble over words and make things even worse. Okay. Any thoughts from other people from the outside on what I've been spewing so far? Finn says yes. Okay, so what is your input?
Still waiting on that input. Alright, well. Where to go from here? One other concern I've been having is the question of resource allocation, I guess.
For layouts, there may sometimes be a need to switch to a different structure instead of adjusting parameter like in responsive web stuff.
Oh, you mean depending on the sizing constraints, the layout needs to change completely? That is an interesting thought. Yes. I'm not, Yeah.
Yes, since you mentioned screen size.
That's an interesting thought, yeah. Yeah, I don't really... Can't really think of any better solutions than, you know, basically what you do in CSS, which is define minimum and maximum sizes, at which points you just do different layouting rules. So there would need to be some kind of hook on the current screen size that decides which layout to use. Which means the layouting would need to be detached from the actual components entirely. So if we're speaking in more concrete terms, you would have, I guess, some kind of structure for focus. So you would have some kind of tree for focus. Let's say, you know, something like this. And then you might have multiple kinds of layouts that each have things, you know, depending on the algorithm you use, they might have stuff structured differently. So you might have something like that has a completely flat structure, or you may have something that mirrors the focus, or something that goes even deeper depending on what you need to have, or, you know, whatever. Yeah. And then for the rendering itself, you would have a completely flat kind of just iteration over all components where you draw them. Though I don't think that's going to work either. You might need to have a different structure there too. For instance, if you have something that scrolls content, so in order to handle off-screen things, the scroll content, like the scrolling things, needs to be able to sort of apply clipping and other kinds of elimination masks or whatever. So it needs to be nested after all. So here you might have, I don't know, structure like this. I don't know. Yeah. I think the input and the focus trees can at least be the same though. The structure there should probably be shared. Yeah. Right, so essentially when you receive a resize event of some kind, it first needs to select an applicable layout that you constructed, and then tell that layout to recalculate the sizes or the positioning of the elements. But then the question becomes... yeah, no, that's fine. If size changes happen within, then I guess it would have to bubble outwards and redo the calculation from in to out, depending on structure. That's another problem. How is that handled? I guess you would have... So, when a component changes its size, it needs to notify the currently regent layout somehow. And if you have nested layouts like this, how is that gonna work? Typically how this is solved in other things that I've seen is that the component has a parent pointer or some kind of parent thingy to which it tells, oh, I changed size. But if we have multiple possible layouts, there's no such thing as a parent. So there will need to be some kind of other mechanism to determine where to send that size change. So let me just... let's put a question mark there. Okay. I was gonna start some other thought, but I completely forgot what that was. Good on me. The layout thing, though, that you mentioned is actually very interesting, though, because you could also maybe have different layouts depending on whether you're using it with a controller or a mouse. Because I can imagine that you might want to maybe, change how that works as well. Typically, trying to use a UI that's optimized for mouse with a controller is a fucking nightmare, and vice versa. So that's actually a pretty good idea outside of just the dimension constraints. Actually, I gotta be right back. Don't go anywhere. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. What other things do I need to consider? Oh, right, now I remember what I was going to talk about. Resource allocation. So, you know, what I'm primarily intending on using this for, and it might be general enough that it could be used elsewhere, which would be great, but my core focus right now is OpenGL. Specifically OpenGL 3.0 or 3.3 and up core stuff. And in OpenGL core, you need to basically pre-allocate resources you're going to use to draw, because doing anything but that is going to be slow. So essentially, it's very discouraged to allocate resources you're going to need for drawing when you're actually going to do the drawing, which in turn makes it difficult to know, when are you going to actually do these allocations. It's much easier when you can just, draw. Just draw, and everything else is taken care of. But actually issuing rendering commands to OpenGL is quite involved, and yeah. So that's another question that needs to be solved. GL. Now you might argue that, okay, what you can do, for instance, is say, okay, the style worries entirely about how things are drawn. So the style would have to, allocate the necessary resources when it's constructed or whatever, in order to draw all the components it wants to be able to draw. Which might be fine, I don't know. It's just not something I've tried, so I don't know how well that would work out. Let me make that circle a bit nicer. What a nice question mark circle. Bat circle. Ooh, so many bat circles. There we go, that's a better one. Gotta get that. There we go. That's not readable. Gotta get that question mark perfectly. There it is. That's a nice one. It is imperative. Alright, in case you're wondering why I write like this, I don't know, I just do. It's a bad habit. What else do we have? Yeah, the problem of knowing in which order to draw things is also an interesting one. Though I guess... I'm wondering a lot of things. Let me try to gather my thoughts enough to actually talk about it. I'm wondering whether the rendering logic can't just always follow the layout logic. Because essentially, anything where the rendering order actually makes a difference is also going to be represented in the layout. Or in the very least, it seems that way to me when I think about it now. So, things where the rendering order is important is if you have, say, something that can scroll. So you have something that has a limited view, but it extends outwards. So the part that implements the scrolling needs to be able to set a clipping area and control which components are actually being drawn to, save on resources. When you draw a billion size list, you don't want to have to go through all of those and draw them for nothing. Or if you have some kind of component that applies a mask of some kind, like, I don't know, you might have a circle mask, then the outer component is actually going to, or the inner component is going to be within that clipping part. So it's always related to the layout, as far as I can tell. So these could be merged into one, which would simplify things already. Question is then whether we can merge this and this as well. Whether it can be reconciled somehow. Because otherwise, the thought of having to manage all these different tree structures seems like a terror to me, so I would like very much to avoid that. Any objections to the layouts and rendering things, structures being the same? Or are people confused about what I'm even talking about? I imagine that might also be possible.
Sorry, trying to think but can't brain.
That's alright. Yeah, I've been very exhausted in the evening. I almost went to sleep before the stream. I don't know why. Probably because I been up and about a bit too much the past few days. I'll get over it though. I'm glad I'm doing this because there's already been a couple of very good thoughts that came out of this. And pretty much every time I sit down and think about things in this kind of sketch manner, I'm very glad I do, because if I just went ahead and implemented things, I will be wasting so much time realizing my mistakes too late. And even worse than that, just not realizing there are mistakes. Okay. Thinking about how to merge the layout and the input focus part is, I think they need to even be shared in some sense, because if you, or in the very least, if you have different layouts, you would need different input trees as well, or different focus trees as well, because obviously that changes the visual structure, and so needs to follow that as well. But the question is, can I make the layout structure in some sense be the input structure? I don't think so. It does make sense that there needs to be one for each kind of layout that you make, but for instance, you might have a layout that's not very structured at all. So for instance, this energy minimization layout or the constraints-based layout can have lots of different objects in different positions and possibly even nested within themselves without having to have a structure that represents that. Or, as mentioned previously, you might have support structures that should not have any say in the focus at all. The latter case is easily solved because you can just say, okay, this thing does not care about focus at all. It's sort of transparent, and so you just pass the events through, or when you go inside or outside, you just skip over it. It gets a bit more difficult though if, for instance, you have, let's say you have some kind of root thingy like this, and then you have two different structures that should be like invisible, I guess. And then you have two more. Or actually, let me make a sensible example with this. You might have something like this, where you want to have a quit button at the bottom, and you want to have a menu of other buttons at the top, but they all should be in the same focus group so you can cycle through them in one go. But you might nest them in two separate containers. And so the question of focus is more difficult when you have two transparent ones, because it needs to know to transcend into this one and then go out once you go from this to this and then go back in. It's an implementation detail, but it makes it a bit more annoying than if you simply had a separate tree that directly tells you this information. I suppose it would also allow the user more flexibility over how control is handled, which might be a good thing. Good thing in terms of, more control is better, but bad thing in terms of it might become very verbose, so I'm not entirely sure yet how to handle that. That trade-off. It might be a default way of constructing. Actually, now that I think about it, I think you could reasonably construct an input or a focus tree based on the layout tree in many cases, where you can mark certain layout components as sort of structural, I guess, and then when you enter components into that, it'll automatically enter them into the next available focus tree part that's associated with the parent of that, I guess. So you would have each thing tied to its representation in the focus tree. So you might have a let me make a different thing here, hold on. So you would have it like just this here, and the link would be from this to this, and from this to this, and from this to this, and so forth. And so these dotted ones would not be present at all. And when you construct this part and you add, say, this one into the dotted part, it knows the dotted part doesn't have a representation. It's not useful for that, so it just goes into the parent, and this one does have one, so it adds it to this, and then you get the link there. So that might be possible, though again, not for all kinds of. Yeah, that only works for the box kind of model or I guess for the document kind of model of layouting. It doesn't work for constraints or energy minimization where things are much more fluid. Yeah. I think you need to construct it manually. Shouldn't be a big problem. Could probably make it really convenient to do, or very shorthand to do. But yeah. In the very least, what's clear is that you need a different tree for every layout that you do, or potentially one anyway. That is completely unreadable. Okay. Yeah, this makes sense to me. Yeah, I think the GL resource thingy though is gonna have to be just up to the implementer of the style. There is the question of reusability. So if everything, you know, how a component is drawn is completely dependent on the style, there's no way to implement, say, a default rendering capability because you have no idea how the style is going to render anything. Though, I suppose you could make like a style class that presents a simplistic drawing interface, which the component could then use to present a default one, and anything that supports this simple interface or protocol is going to be a subclass of that style. Yeah, so that should work actually. I think that's good. Yeah, I like that. So we can still put all of that onto this style. Okay, yeah, that seems fine actually. Good. Though I guess there is a problem when you have things like images that should be drawn. Oh shit, thing just fell off my pen. Fuck. Hold on. I gotta search for that. Oh, there it is. Found it. Keep fiddling with my pen, and it has like buttons. The pen has buttons on it, but there's like a very cheap cap on top of to make the buttons into buttons, you know? And that keeps falling off as I fiddle with the pen. Okay, anyway. Yeah, images and stuff. That's another thing. Because those... I guess you would need to have... That is tough. I guess when a component needs to draw some kind of image, it needs to request that image from the style. I don't know. Or actually, we have a target argument, which is unused. If anything, it should need it from the target backend. And the style would only be the rendering. So so there needs to be some kind of resource, some kind of protocol for the target that allows you to allocate resources for images and other kinds of things. Or do we need the target argument at all? That's another question. Could merge it into the style so that you might have styles that are generic depending on the backend, I guess, and you would just create a new class that has the style and the backend as superclasses. I knew that this would happen, that was just gonna be long spans of absolutely nothing happening on stream. And I do apologize for that. But can't think any faster, I'm sorry. And this needs to be done. These problems need to be solved before an attempt at an implementation can be done. Another question is, when and how are these layouts constructed? Because you would need some kind of, kind of function that has access to all the components that need to be displayed in this current view, I guess, and then compose them somehow. I guess that would also at the same time handle the focus. Yeah, so you would have like 2 stages to it, I guess. One great needed components. So you say which kinds of components, buttons and sliders and text boxes and what have you you're gonna want. And you give each one of those a name, and then you have a separate thing where you connect these components together into a layout and into a focus tree, inserting containers as necessary. So, for instance, if you have a scroll thingy, then you would create that here. Or, nah. Would you? Yes, you would. Would you? Yes. But would you? Probably. Create. Wait, would you? Yeah, Yeah, so things like a scrolling area, or like, I don't know what people like in games, like a carousel, or what is this called? A fan menu, I guess. So stuff that like that would all be part of step 2, where you create a layout and the focus tree. Right. So you would first create all the components that you need functionality-wise. So you do it in distinct steps. First you say, okay, I'm going to actually need these kinds of things to handle the tasks that the user should be able to fulfill. And then you create one or more UI structures based on these components. And during that step, you decide on the visual layout and the focus layout. And you might need to insert additional kinds of components that are purely there for focus or layout purposes. So layout including things like scrolling or a fan menu or other kinds of grouping or layouting structures. And these two, a pair of these two is then bundled together into a UI structure which encompasses both the layouting, the rendering, and the focus management for the runtime. After that, you create a specific style which handles the backend allocation and the specific look and feel of the components used. Then you select the active layout, and then you just draw and handle input continuously until you change the layout again. I guess if you need to dynamically change things, so if you at runtime need to add or remove stuff, then it's gonna get a bit more complicated. Suppose if you remove or add entire entities, then you would need to rebalance this UI structure anyway. So you would have to update both the layouts and the focus tree. But I don't really see any immediate ramifications of doing so. The problem that I'm still thinking about more is how to handle when a component actually influences the current layouting. I guess it would just have to signal directly to the layout that it changed size. So when its constraints change, or yeah, it would be a change of constraints. Right, yeah. So when a component's constraints change, then the layout needs to somehow either directly do the size recomputation, or it needs to somehow traverse its structure until it finds whatever is responsible and then bubble upwards or something like that. Yeah. Again, this is because we can't store parent pointers in the components themselves because they might have a multitude of layouts. I guess you could have like a table in the layout itself that tells you what's the parent of any given component. Yeah, okay. So it's not too bad when you just signal to active layout. Okay. So the only problem left is if one of your components is some kind of drawing resource. So if not, if something needs to be drawn that's not determined entirely by the style, which might not. I'm not sure if you even want to permit that at all. It might be better if that's not... I guess you need to do that at some points, though. Like if you want to draw like a user-generated image or some bullshit. For most things, though, you can avoid it. For instance, like icons and stuff like that should definitely be controlled by the style itself. So for those things, you would probably have some kind of identifier for what you want to be drawn instead of actually the raw pixel data. But for some things, you can't avoid just having the raw pixel data. In which case, it's gonna be troublesome. I guess you would have to do a similar kind of interface as I do in Trial, where you have a register object for rendering kind of thing, where each component, in this case each UI component that you want to be drawn in a given style first, before you can draw it, needs to call this function, so that the style can do necessary allocations ahead of time. So I guess that would be a solution. Yeah, I don't see any way around it. I guess it could do a thing like where the style itself needs to notice at runtime whether it has its resources allocated and then needs to do a caching, but that seems... I don't know. That's possible as well. Would definitely be easier on the user for runtime changes. Yeah. I mean, honestly, you could probably get away with, even in GL 3.3, you could probably get away with just streaming all the UI data all the time, probably. But I would still rather avoid that if possible in the design, so you can achieve maximum performance if needed. Because, sometimes you really don't have a lot to spare in games. So, as usual, it's not my immediate number one concern, but I would like to not rule it out. Yeah. By the way, can you even read what I'm writing at all on stream? Is that even visible? Or is it too small and too slurred?
Your writing is very clear.
Okay, thanks, I guess. Oh my god, phone. Yeah, that Emeus or whatever, Emeus kind of thingy from GDK is very interesting. Yeah, that might be a very nice layout mechanism to implement as well. Though it needs a constraint solver, of course, so that might be a challenge. The energy minimization thing is a lot easier to implement, question mark, but it might be a lot harder to control as a result. Essentially all you need is a forward Euler kind of thing. I hope. I don't know whether that's the case, but I hope it is. Yeah, it's that thing entirely is also a big question mark. Oh shit, it's almost time already. Well, I'll be damned. Yeah, so I'm not done thinking about all this, but I hope I'm done soon enough that we can start at least trying some stuff or implementing parts of it. But especially because I'm so unsure about this, I would be overjoyed if people could give me some feedback and some of their own thoughts, and even if there's just a small thing that you're unsure about, something that you don't understand, or something that seems weird, or something like that, any form of doubt or uncertainty or bad feeling, do let me know, because it is, when you're dealing with complex systems, it is all too easy to just lose sight of things and think that everything is much clearer than it actually is. So it is very easy to miss the forest for the trees, as they say. Yeah. So if anything comes to mind, please let me know. Wherever you want, IRC, Twitter, email. Yeah. But I think I'm gonna end it here for tonight. I gotta get ready for a movie. Yeah. I'm not sure what's gonna be tomorrow. Maybe if I make enough advances in feeling sure about things, we can start implementing something. If not, then it's completely up in the air. I might just do some miscellaneous stuff for Leaf. I don't know. Yeah, we'll have to see. Anyway, thanks again to everyone for joining up and providing some input and some insight. And, you know, all of those
Thank you for
things.
streaming.
Yeah. Have a good night, everybody.